He told me my ideas were outdated, then handed my role to his son before lunch. I didn't argue. I just walked out and started something they'd never see coming. Months later, when their biggest contract was on the line, my new company was sitting across the table, and I was holding the winning design. Some call it revenge, I call it redirection. Stay with me to the end, and if you've ever been replaced by someone who didn't earn it, subscribe and tell me your story below. When the new CEO's son walked into the conference room, I already knew what was coming. The smug confidence in his stride, the way he avoided eye contact, it was the look of someone who'd rehearsed the script. I'd seen it before, in quieter betrayals, in board decisions made behind closed doors. But this time, it was my turn on the chopping block. "Marie," he began, resting his hands on the table as if he owned it. "We're going in a new direction." He was 28, fresh out of a management program, the kind who'd never missed a bonus or worried about payroll. I stayed still, my expression calm. "That direction doesn't include you," he added. No hesitation, no apology. I'd spent 15 years building NorthAxis freight systems from a 2-floor warehouse into a multi-state logistics engine. I'd architected the predictive routing software that cut costs by 30% and made us competitive against giants. Yet here I was, being dismissed by a kid who hadn't even been around when the servers still overheated in summer. I could have argued. I could have listed every contract, every crisis, every all-nighter that kept this company alive. But I didn't. People like him didn't fire you because of performance. They fired you to rewrite history, to erase the people who made their fathers look less visionary. "You'll get a generous exit package," he said, as if that made up for erasure. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and smiled faintly. "Then I guess you're free to go in your new direction," I replied. He frowned, not sure if I was mocking him. I wasn't. Not yet. As I walked out of the office I'd designed, past the frame certificates and the team photo from our first major expansion, the sting wasn't from the loss. It was from the silence. No one met my eyes. No one said a word. The people I'd mentored, defended, and fought for suddenly found their keyboards fascinating. I didn't blame them. Fear travels fast in corporate hallways. By the time I reached the elevator, I'd made my decision. There would be no tears, no scenes, no desperate calls to the founder. Let them believe they'd won. Let them believe I'd fade quietly. I stepped outside into the chill Seattle air, the kind that cuts straight through fabric and forces you to wake up. My phone buzzed with HR's off-boarding checklist, return badge, laptop, keys. I turned it off. I wasn't angry, I was focused. They thought firing me removed an obstacle, but all they'd done was remove a filter. I'd spent years suppressing my better instincts for diplomacy, loyalty, restraint. That ended today. As I walked toward my car, I looked up at the NorthAxis logo on the glass facade, sleek, proud, and shallow. They'd built their future on a foundation I'd poured by hand, line by line, algorithm by algorithm. Now they'd have to face what happens when the architect leaves with the blueprint. I didn't go back. I went in a different direction. Before NorthAxis became the freight tech powerhouse plastered across trade journals, it was just a name scribbled in a notebook I carried everywhere. I joined Alan Pierce when the company was nothing more than an empty warehouse and a few secondhand servers. He was the visionary. I was the builder. He dreamed big, but I turned his dreams into data models and logistics maps that actually worked. For 15 years, I believed in that partnership. I built algorithms that predicted truck delays before they happened, optimized inventory rerouting, and transformed chaos into flow. The irony was that the same systems I created to make the company efficient were later used to justify cutting me out. "Automation reduces human dependence," Dylan had said in one of his early presentations, smiling toward me as if it were a compliment. I should have known then. He didn't respect what he couldn't control. After my dismissal, I didn't spiral or rant online. I disappeared, but disappearing isn't the same as giving up. I started revisiting old contacts, people I'd helped years ago when NorthAxis was still begging for contracts. One of them, a quiet CEO named Serena Chow, ran a small logistics startup called Vector Path Solutions. They'd been overshadowed by NorthAxis for years, but had something more valuable than scale: humility. "You built the routing core for NorthAxis, didn't you?" she asked over coffee. I nodded, careful not to sound bitter. "I designed it," I said, "but they built their brand around it." She smiled, sharp but warm. "I don't need a brand. I need a system that actually works." There it was, the opening, not revenge, opportunity. Vector Path was small but promising. They lacked infrastructure and data depth, but their leadership actually listened. When I outlined a plan to modernize their predictive network using newer adaptive algorithms, they didn't push back or explain why it wasn't realistic. They asked how soon we could start. I joined within a week. The team was lean: developers, logistics analysts, and a handful of engineers who weren't jaded yet. They treated me as one of them, not as a relic from some larger firm. The difference was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I wasn't explaining why something mattered. I was being asked how to make it better. The industry thought I'd retired quietly. NorthAxis certainly did. Dylan was too busy pushing flashy initiatives to notice what was happening in the shadows. He loved appearances, sleek dashboards, buzzwords, shallow partnerships. But he'd never understood that logistics wasn't about appearances. It was about precision, timing, trust. That was my battlefield. At Vector Path, I started rebuilding what I once made, only sharper. The system at NorthAxis had always frustrated me, tangled by corporate politics, optimized for optics instead of function. So I stripped the clutter, rebuilt it modularly, added machine learning layers that adapted routes in real time using regional data. I even resurrected an old prototype Alan once rejected because it was too ambitious for investors. The irony, that same prototype would later become the reason NorthAxis lost their biggest account. My days blurred into nights of code, diagrams, and coffee. But this time, it wasn't about loyalty, it was about clarity. I was no longer protecting a legacy, I was forging an alternative. VectorPath's growth was quiet but exponential. Our pilot with a mid-sized freight distributor reduced delivery errors by 40% in 3 months. That single success attracted attention we hadn't anticipated. Investors started circling. Meanwhile, Dylan at NorthAxis was celebrating another acquisition, one that stretched their systems beyond capacity. The first cracks began to show in their operations. I watched silently, not with glee, but with certainty. Systems fail when built on ego. I didn't tell anyone at VectorPath my history. They didn't need to know. They hired me for what I could do now, not what I'd lost before. But late at night, when I reviewed the performance dashboards glowing green across all metrics, I'd think about NorthAxis's servers, how their code still contained pieces of me. They thought they'd erased me. What they didn't realize was that I'd already rewritten myself. The war had started long before they noticed, and by the time they did, it would be too late to call it a comeback. It would look like evolution. At VectorPath, I learned that silence could be the sharpest weapon. We didn't announce anything publicly, didn't brag about partnerships or release prototypes for hype. We built in quiet precision, piece by piece. I focused on scalability, systems that could grow without collapsing under their own success, the same flaw that was now cracking NorthAxis's foundation. Their obsession with speed and expansion had made them brittle. I could see it in the trade data, in freight latency reports that started leaking into public databases. They were growing too fast to notice their inefficiencies. That's when I proposed something Serena hadn't considered: an adaptive logistics intelligence engine that would use predictive mapping, live traffic telemetry, and supplier redundancy metrics all in one dashboard. She stared at the whiteboard like she was watching magic. "You can build that?" she asked. "Already have," I said, tapping the corner of my notebook where the original prototype lived. NorthAxis had dismissed it years ago, calling it unnecessary complexity. Now it would become their competitor's backbone. We called the system PulseNet. Every route it calculated improved the next one. Every delay became data fuel. The more it ran, the smarter it got. It wasn't just logistics anymore. It was intuition, written in code. Within 6 months, PulseNet began outperforming our best forecasts. Freight clients who'd been ignored by NorthAxis started calling us. They wanted accuracy, not flash. We delivered both. The first time our metrics beat theirs in a regional performance report, Serena sent me a single message. "They're asking questions." I smiled but said nothing. Let them wonder who was behind it. I'd never sought credit. Results were louder. Around that time, Dylan started pushing his new campaign, Next Gen Routing Initiative. I recognized the branding, the hollow language, the desperation to look innovative without understanding what innovation meant. He was fixing problems I'd already solved 3 years earlier, only with twice the budget and none of the insight. NorthAxis began slipping behind contractually. One of their oldest partners, a national retail chain, had an upcoming renewal bid worth tens of millions. Dylan planned to secure it as proof of his leadership. I knew because I'd helped negotiate that same client's first deal years ago. I knew their pain points, their priorities, and exactly where NorthAxis had failed them lately. I didn't leak information. I didn't need to. I just knew how to build a better answer. VectorPath prepared a bid so efficient, so technically elegant, that even if NorthAxis undercut the price, they couldn't match the performance. I was designing what they feared most. A mirror of their own creation evolved beyond them. By the time the proposal deadline arrived, PulseNet had processed enough real-time data to produce an impossible advantage. We weren't competing with them. We were outpacing them by entire weeks of intelligence. Serena didn't ask where my certainty came from, and I didn't offer it. The less they knew about my past, the cleaner this victory would be. What drove me wasn't vengeance. It was precision, the satisfaction of solving an equation that someone else had corrupted. When you build systems long enough, you learn a truth. Efficiency always wins. I wasn't destroying NorthAxis. I was simply proving what happens when someone finally listens. The morning of the National Freight Consortium pitch felt strangely calm. No nerves, no caffeine jitters, just the stillness that comes when you know exactly what's about to happen. The conference center in Chicago buzzed with executives, investors, and logistics officers from across the country. For weeks, industry whispers had called this the most valuable contract of the decade, worth hundreds of millions in annual distribution routes and digital integration rights. To everyone else, it was a business opportunity. To me, it was the culmination of quiet years spent rebuilding what arrogance had discarded. VectorPath's team took our seats early. Serena briefed the panel, poised and confident, while I reviewed our final data sets in silence. PulseNet had evolved beyond its prototype. It now predicted cargo routing patterns days in advance, adjusting for weather, fuel fluctuations, and even driver behavior analytics. Every simulation we ran came back flawless. Across the hall, I caught sight of NorthAxis's entourage entering. Their glossy suits, their entourage of consultants, their new marketing director flanking Dylan like armor. He had the same smirk as the day he fired me, except now it looked forced. I doubted he'd even notice my name on the VectorPath presenter list. Why would he? To him, I was ancient history. That ignorance would be his undoing. The presentations were back-to-back. NorthAxis went first, showcasing a slick deck filled with buzzwords: disruptive, autonomous, hyperscalable. Their slides gleamed with motion graphics, but the substance was hollow. They spoke in abstractions about innovation while PulseNet was already running live demonstrations behind the scenes. When they finished, polite applause filled the room, the kind given to a known brand, not a promising idea. Then it was our turn. Serena opened with a single line that turned heads. "We're not here to promise efficiency, we're here to prove it." She gestured to me, and I connected our live dashboard to the projector. Routes, costs, emissions data, and real-time adjustments flickered on the screen, each update syncing perfectly across 3 devices. "This isn't simulated," I said evenly. "These are live routes currently active across 5 states. Gasps replaced applause. For every question from the panel, fuel spikes, weather hazards, last-mile tracking, PulseNet adjusted instantly, displaying new calculations before anyone could blink. The room was silent except for the hum of servers syncing data in real time. When I finished, Serena leaned forward. "The technology you've just seen was built to adapt faster than human bias," she said. "No assumptions, no shortcuts, just performance." We sat down to a wave of quiet astonishment. NorthAxis executives exchanged uncertain glances. Dylan looked paler by the minute. I didn't smile. I didn't even look his way. I simply waited. After an hour of deliberation, the consortium's decision came through, a unanimous vote. VectorPath had secured the contract. The announcement was public before we even packed up our laptops. Our phones buzzed with messages from reporters, partners, and venture firms. NorthAxis's PR team tried to spin the loss as strategic realignment, but industry analysts knew better. Within days, trade publications were calling it the upset of the decade. What no one knew, not yet, was that the architect of VectorPath's victory was the same woman NorthAxis had discarded as obsolete. A week later, I received the inevitable call, first from a private number, then from Alan himself. I didn't answer. Then came the email from NorthAxis HR, subject line, reconnection opportunity. The message was brief, formal, and desperate. "Marie, we'd like to discuss a potential advisory role and are open to revisiting your prior position." I stared at the screen for a long moment. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. They weren't reaching out because they'd changed. They were reaching out because they finally understood what they'd lost. I closed the email, marked it as read, and went back to work. That same afternoon, Serena walked into my office holding her phone. "They just announced layoffs," she said softly. "NorthAxis cut a quarter of their operations team after the contract loss." I nodded once. "They built fast," I said, "but never strong." The irony was almost poetic. I didn't post anything online, didn't brag, didn't correct the headlines. People assumed VectorPath had stumbled upon a brilliant engineer. Let them. My power wasn't in being known. It was in being underestimated. The silence I carried from the day I walked out of NorthAxis had transformed into something sharper, cleaner, untraceable. In the end, I didn't destroy them. They'd done that themselves. I just gave the world a better option. The calls came in waves, first polite, then insistent, then quietly desperate. NorthAxis wanted to meet, to discuss possible collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who'd escorted me out of the building without a second glance were now tripping over themselves to schedule lunch. I ignored the first few messages, telling myself I was too busy, but the truth was simpler. I didn't owe them my time. I had already given them years. I had built their backbone, their credibility, their future. Letting them collapse under the weight of their own hubris wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. Dylan sent the last message himself. "I think we both made mistakes," he wrote, as if firing someone who built your empire was a mutual misunderstanding. I didn't delete it. I left it unread, sitting at the top of my inbox like an artifact. The only response I gave was silence. There was a time when being ignored would have driven me insane, when validation still felt like proof that I mattered. Now I understood something far more powerful. Acknowledgement is overrated. Results speak louder. While NorthAxis scrambled to contain its fallout, VectorPath was expanding. Our new contract opened doors to government logistics, energy transport, even aerospace distribution. PulseNet became the standard everyone wanted. We hired new teams, opened 2 additional offices, and started attracting talent from the very companies that once dismissed us. I could feel the tide shifting in the industry, a quiet recognition that competence had finally outpaced pedigree. I didn't need revenge. The market was serving it for me. Still, every time I saw an industry headline mentioning NorthAxis, I couldn't help but glance at the details. Leadership changes, restructuring, layoffs. It was the slow unraveling of arrogance playing out in real time. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I'd learned long ago that revenge doesn't need witnesses to count. One evening, as I updated my project milestones, I logged into LinkedIn out of habit. My title now read, Chief Systems Architect, VectorPath Solutions. Below it, a flood of new connection requests from analysts, recruiters, former colleagues, And somewhere in that list, I saw Dylan's name. I hovered over the notification for a second, then clicked ignore. After that, I set my profile to private. There's a quiet moment that comes after the storm, the part no one tells you about, when the adrenaline fades and you realize the revenge everyone expected isn't actually what you wanted. I used to think satisfaction would come the day NorthAxis crumbled, that seeing them lose contracts and credibility would feel like justice. But when it happened, what I felt wasn't triumph. It was distance. They were still trapped in the same arrogance that had pushed me out. I had simply evolved past it. In the months after our victory, people in the industry started calling me the architect who vanished. They wanted interviews, podcasts, book deals. I declined them all. The truth was simple. I hadn't vanished. I'd just chosen to work where merit still mattered. At VectorPath, I spent my mornings walking through the operations floor, listening to teams discuss routing anomalies, driver patterns, and new algorithmic improvements. They spoke with ownership, not fear. It reminded me why I'd stayed in logistics all those years, because the work mattered. Because the people who actually built things rarely got the credit, but they always carried the integrity that held everything together. NorthAxis had forgotten that. They built a culture around image, not impact. And when image cracked, there was nothing left to hold them up. Every time I was invited to speak at a panel, I used the opportunity to talk about something I wished I'd learned earlier. Never confuse loyalty with silence. Companies will frame your devotion as stability until it's no longer convenient for them. What I built at VectorPath wasn't just a platform. It was proof that loyalty means very little when it isn't mutual. Still, I didn't shut them out completely. A few of my old colleagues reached out privately, some to apologize, others to thank me for creating something better to aspire to. I met one of them for coffee. He said, "You know, the place hasn't felt the same since you left." I smiled. It's not supposed to. Growth isn't about going back to fix what was broken. It's about building something stronger so you never have to. Years from now, NorthAxis will still exist in some form. Companies like that always do, but they'll be a relic of what happens when ego outruns competence. My name won't be in their reports or history books, and that's fine. The people who matter know. The employees who stayed at VectorPath know. The clients who trust our system know. I didn't need public credit to validate the work. I just needed the work to live. That's the kind of revenge that lasts. Not destruction, but creation. Because I didn't destroy them. I just outgrew them. 10 years have passed since that contract turned the industry upside down, and I still keep one thing from my NorthAxis days. A small notebook, edges frayed, filled with scribbled diagrams from the nights Alan and I built our first routing model. I used to look at it with bitterness. Now, it reminds me of how far perspective can travel when you stop chasing validation and start building for yourself. VectorPath has grown into a global network, its technology powering everything from emergency supply routes to humanitarian logistics. I oversee the innovation lab now, mentoring young engineers who remind me of myself before I learned what corporate loyalty really costs. They ask questions that used to get me labeled difficult, and I encourage every single one of them to keep asking. Sometimes during our sessions, one of them will say, "You must have had great mentors." I smile because I did, and also because I became the one I needed back then. Every so often, a familiar name crosses my inbox. NorthAxis, looking for collaboration, their tone polished and polite, pretending we're equals again. I don't ignore them anymore. I forward their inquiries to business development with a short note. Standard rates apply. That's not revenge, that's equilibrium. In the end, the real payoff wasn't money, contracts, or recognition. It was autonomy. I learned that power doesn't come from titles or corner offices. It comes from knowing that your work, your integrity, your contribution can't be erased by anyone's last name. The company that once defined me is now a footnote in my story, while the one that believed in me became my legacy. When I walk through the VectorPath headquarters and see teams brainstorming around whiteboards covered in code and chaos, I feel something close to peace. They don't know the story behind the woman who leads them, and they don't need to. What matters is that they're building without fear, just like I do now. I glance once more at the old notebook before I lock my office for the night. The handwriting is messy, the ink fading, but the foundation is still strong, just like me. Looking back, I realize revenge was never really the point. What I wanted was recognition, fairness, and proof that integrity could still win in a world obsessed with titles and shortcuts. When Dylan fired me, I thought the loss was professional, but it was personal. I'd built my identity around being loyal to a company that saw loyalty as expendable. Leaving wasn't just walking away from a job, it was walking towards self-respect. What I learned, painfully and completely, is that sometimes the most powerful response isn't outrage or confrontation. It's redirection. Instead of trying to tear down what betrayed me, I built something better, and that became its own justice. There's a moment when you realize forgiveness and silence are not the same thing. Forgiveness frees you, but silence, strategic, intentional silence, forces those who wronged you to live with the echoes of what they destroyed. I didn't need to destroy NorthAxis. They did that themselves when they stopped listening to the people who built their foundation. I simply gave the world a reminder that substance always outlasts noise. For anyone watching who's been overlooked, underestimated, or erased, take this as a quiet reminder that your worth isn't measured by the people who fail to see it. Sometimes you win, not by shouting your truth, but by living it. The world notices integrity more than you think. It just takes time. How to get started today. Start small. Write down what you've built that no one can take credit for. Revisit your unfinished ideas, the ones dismissed as too ambitious. Reach out to someone who values your contribution and start building something with them, even if it's tiny. Protect your work. Document your worth. And most importantly, never let someone else's short-sightedness define your legacy. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been replaced, underestimated, or quietly erased, leave a comment below. Tell me what you learned from your own chapter. Share this video with someone who's rebuilding after betrayal, and if you haven't yet, subscribe. Because this channel isn't about destruction, it's about rising smarter.